I'm going to be reading from Killer Routine, and the protagonist, the narrator, his name is Channing Hayes. He's a stand-up comic, and he's depressed. He's working with his fiancée, who passed away recently. He's working with his fiancée's sister to mentor her to become a stand-up comic. And the night before the scene starts, she disappeared before she went on stage. The next morning, I woke up around 10, early for me, downed a bowl of Cocoa Puffs, skimmed the sports section, and flipped on the Cartoon Network. After a few minutes without finding anything remotely humorous, I turned the set off. Where were Ren and Stimpy when you needed them? The great thing about working nights was sleeping in and having your days free to watch mindless junk on TV. What better way was there for a 33-year-old to spend his time? Besides thinking about Heather's disappearance, of course. Two possibilities came to mind. Either she bolted due to a gigantic bout of stage fright, or something else was going on in her life, something bad enough to freak her out. If it was just a bad case of nerves, like Artie and Skip thought, then I needed to pump her up, make sure her psyche hadn't crumbled. Lauren had been stolen in a cruel accident, but I'd be damned if I was going to let the tragedy affect her sister's career, as long as I had something to do with it. On the other hand, if something bad had happened, I wanted to know about it, to help if I could. Bottom line, I needed to talk to her, now. I called her cell but didn't get through, so I left a message asking her to call me as soon as she could. I tried the phone at her apartment too, but it rang until the machine picked up. I left another message for her to call me, and this time I was pretty sure the urgency I felt came through loud and clear, despite the static-filled connection. Lauren always complained about my lack of patience, but I was never patient enough to sit down and consider changing my ways. After waiting about half an hour for Heather to return my calls, I decided to drive out to her place. Maybe she was hiding in her apartment, ashamed of what had happened last night, unable to leave the safety of her bed, and unwilling to answer the phone to talk about it. As I unlocked the door to my vintage 1983 RX-7 in the parking lot, I remembered my first date with Lauren. We'd done the boring, dinner and a movie, but what had stayed with me was her expression when I told her I'd named my car Rex. For a moment, she'd stared at me, trying to determine if I were putting her on. Then her face contorted into a grimace Edvard Munch would envy before she exploded in laughter. Her reaction had surprised me. Didn't all guys name their cars? Now, though, the joy I got driving Rex had diminished considerably. A car was just a car, after all. I took I-66 away from town to Route 50, heading west along 3 or 4 miles of commercial congestion, passing shopping centers and fast food restaurants and blossoming townhouse developments. Traffic was sluggish, and the roads that had once been bad only during rush hour now were clogged all day. The trip to Heather's Chantilly apartment, which would have taken about 15 minutes sans traffic, took about 35. Her complex was only a few hundred yards off the main drag, yet it felt much farther from civilization. The parking lot was mostly empty, and those cars that remained were old, American, and in need of Earl Shive's deluxe package. Heather lived on the second floor of a 3-story building, one of 4 buildings laid out around a central common area. 2 toddlers played next to a dilapidated playground set, their mother, or sitter, watching them over a newspaper from a nearby wooden bench, cigarette dangling from her lips. She glanced in my direction as I climbed the stairs, saw I wasn't Ed McMahon toting an oversized multi-million-dollar check, and returned to her daily horoscopes. A 3-inch rectangle of paint had peeled off Heather's front door right below the number 223, revealing a layer of yellow paint beneath the more recent washed-out brown. I rapped on the door a few times, loud enough to wake her if she were still in bed. Lauren and I had tried to talk her out of living here, but Heather yearned for independence, and most of the nicer places closer in were too expensive to swing without a roommate. I waited a minute and knocked again, waited 15 more seconds, then rang the bell. I didn't hear a chime inside, so I pressed it again, listening more carefully. And again, nothing. Busted, right along with everything else in this forsaken place. I glanced down at the play area, and the 2 kids seemed to be wrestling over a doll, one of them wailing pretty good. The mother kept her head in the paper, no doubt inured to the crying and tantrums. I guess it helped to be inured to a lot of things if you lived in this dump. After a final rat-a-tat-tat, I left to find the property manager. Back at ground level, I followed a small sign pointing the way to the rental office, located in a building on the other side of the play area. As I approached the mother on the bench, I nodded and said hello. She glared at me and opened her mouth to respond, but thought better of it, returning to her paper, careful not to engage me in any way. You try to be friendly and all you get is heartache. The rental office occupied the corner unit on the first floor. A tiny laminated piece of cardboard on the door instructed visitors to ring bell for service. I poked the doorbell button with my finger but didn't hear anything. After another poke, I gave up and knocked on the door. I heard someone yell something unintelligible from inside, and the door opened a moment later. A stocky woman with curly red hair, not a shape found in nature, or on most people's heads for that matter, peered at me over a pair of bifocals. Her pinched face scowled at me. Can't you read the sign? Ring the freaking bell next time. I did, must be broken. Her eyes narrowed to slits. We've got 2 vacant units, both 1 bedroom, both ground floor, first month, last month, and 2 months security deposit. She stepped back a smidge and looked me up and down, twice. Assuming you qualify, the rents, I held up my hand. I'm not interested in an apartment. I'm looking for Heather Dempsey. She cocked her head at me. Unit 223, pretty blonde. She gave me a quick nod. Unit 223 is in the first building across the way. She jerked her thumb over her shoulder and started to close the door. I slipped my shoe into harm's way. The door bumped against it and I felt the pressure as the landlady continued to try to shove it closed. Yes, I know, she didn't answer. She looked down at my shoe, then at me. Didn't say anything, just glowered. I imagined her anger causing her scarlet hair to ignite. I shrugged and withdrew my foot. Sorry. Have you seen her? I've got 48 units. You think I keep tabs on everybody's whereabouts? I got a life, you know. Some life. Can you let me in? I'm worried something might have happened to her. Who are you, David Caruso? I can't just let you in because you're worried. I don't even know who the hell you are. She snorted. I haven't seen you around here before. I dropped Heather off or picked her up a dozen times, sometimes with Lauren, sometimes without. I didn't recall seeing her either. Well, she's probably with one of them other guys. What guys? She tossed her head as if everyone on the planet knew about them other guys. 4 or 5 different ones, all hours. Got a few calls from the neighbors. Walls are a little thin in spots. Know what I mean? When I first met Heather, she used to go through boyfriends like tissues. But she'd been trying really hard since the accident to get her life together, and I thought she'd been doing a good job of it. Even introduced me to some reasonable-looking guy a few weeks ago named Ryan, who turned out to be a roommate of Skip's buddy. Look, I'm a friend of hers, and I'm concerned. She doesn't answer her phone or her cell, or the door. She could have had some kind of seizure or something, or fallen in the shower. And she didn't answer when you knocked? Nope, she sure didn't. I gave her my best puppy dog face. Well then, I guess she ain't home. Sorry, buddy, can't let you in. She drew herself up and stuck her ample chest out. Now, if you want to rent a place, we can keep talking. Otherwise, I got stuff to do. I sighed loudly to make sure my displeasure was noted. Listen, if you see her, could you give me a call? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a business card, held it up to her. She plucked it out of my hand, examined it. The last laugh, eh? What are you, a comedian? You don't seem very funny to me. I got that a lot. Will you call me? Her hand dropped to her side and she squinted at me with one eye. Why should I? If you do, I'll introduce you to my friend, Andrew Jackson. Something awakened behind her porcine mask. You got a friend named Grant? And we'll talk. Sure, I said, but the door had already shut.